Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Security Repo podcast. Alert fatigue is a real problem, and it's something that if you've worked in security for a minute, you would have dealt with. It's this idea that we're constantly bombarded with security alerts, that we actually don't know what's important and what's not, and it means that real alerts and malicious users can slip through the cracks because we're so inundated by non-important noise. And it's not just those in security, it's the adjacent faculties as well, like your developers or your product managers, that also suffer from this. And this noise is actually what we're going to be talking about today and reducing it. We have a great guest with us that's got some opinions on this, Buck Bundhund, who's a seasoned technology professional of over 20 plus years working in IT. Buck started his career in the late 1990s as a network engineer and a network administrator. He moved into cybersecurity in the early 2000s, working in a startup on one of the early web application firewall spaces. So it's going to be interesting to uncover some of that. And Buck has also worked on lots of other technologies, including high-speed packet capture, packet brokers, cloud services, XDR, SIEM, EDR. There's a bunch of other technologies in here, but he has a wide knowledge of lots of different avenues in cybersecurity. So Buck, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me on here. It's great to be here and appreciate you giving me the time.
Thank you very much for being here, Buck. It was great to meet you recently at BurbSec here in the great Chicago area. We have an awesome security community and meet you. And we had a great conversation about noise to signal ratio, specifically data noise. And that's really what you're addressing with the Centripetal Networks. But I was hoping you could just frame the problem for us here at the beginning. Like, what noise are we talking about?
You know, it's interesting because everybody talks about, and I think Mackenzie started off by alert fatigue, and it's true. Everybody, you know, the largest conversation I hear, whether it's vendors or end users, for the last few years has been alert fatigue. And so when I came to Centripetal, you know, I understood somewhat what they were doing because I'd worked in, you know, threat intelligence or different things before. And when I got here, when you could definitively see what the actual challenge was. And so first, let's define noise. Noise is the way, you know, I would look at it, the way we look at it is any data that's coming from the internet into your environment that is not intended for the purpose of the app or the business, right? It's unintended traffic. So a lot of people think of it as, you know, scanning, reconnaissance, anything like that, where there's nefarious, but there's also a lot of other data. I think what's interesting to me is how much advertising data there is out there. You have all these mobile devices, their app updates, if they get the free version of the app is communicating to constantly, you know, cycle their ads within that. And what that creates is not only a lot of noise, but it creates opportunity because it adds a bunch of extra data that that's not supposed to be there, but you've normalized it being there. And anytime you do that, you leave yourself open to saying, oh, that's just advertising mobile device traffic, right? So I'm not going to look at that. It's not necessarily bad or whatever. And so that's really what noise is. Anything not intended for the environment or for the purpose of the app or business. And it's a ton.
I'd love to dig into what you mean by environment a little bit, because I think of network noise and I think of like, all right, it hit the network and sure, I have to deal with it as an end user. It's like another ad popped up or a URL, but we're really talking about impacting a number of systems here, aren't we?
So as a number of systems, you know, when I started digging more through this in my history of working, you know, all up and down the security stack. And so for me, I started looking at like, if one packet goes into the network, what does that really amount to? And so for me, what I started realizing is on any, you know, SME to enterprise network, one packet goes in and, you know, you have a WAN firewall, you have an east-west firewall, you might have multiple east-west, and then think of every security tool. Some people have an EDR on an endpoint and they have antivirus on an endpoint. They have WAFs, mail security. You just go through that entire stack. Well, if that packet goes through, and let's say someone's trying to log into an email server as admin, right? Okay, admin's been disabled. But that still generated between 8 and 15 at minimum events just from that bad login. If you have an identity access management, it's going to trigger something. So every time a packet goes in, if it's headed towards a legitimate destination, regardless of what it is, it's generating order of magnitude amount of events.
I know we're going to get into it a little bit later, or one of the questions we have for you a little bit later is around costs associated with this, but it just seems like that is driving so much of security and other tooling to be like, hey, we got capacity. We can do this at scale because you're so noisy that it seems like almost the basis for a profit motive. Like, hey, let's address this it's already in your network. We can deal with that kind of scale because we know it's that noisy.
Well, you and I were speaking about this, and I started thinking about it even more after you brought that up. And we started chatting, and I started looking at more data that I had seen. And I could share some, just some statistics later. But when you think about it, we went from early 2000s, you had IPS became around. And then as 2000s went up, people said, I don't know if IPS is it. Some people worried about, because it's signature based, it's stateful packet, signature based. And then it also it tries to do some correlation, if you will. But the challenge is that as data feeds and speeds kept increasing, to do a full a full security at scale for looking at all traffic, when an IPS was still looking at just those things that triggered CVEs, right? But when you look at all the data and you're putting it through, the cost of that appliance, people started building FPGAs. They started doing all this stuff to handle it. And I think people started, I don't know where it started. You bring this up, and I'm not saying it was or wasn't a conscious decision, but I think there was two things. One, people looked at it and they said, the amount that it would cost to build an appliance to do what we do externally outside the firewall, I don't know if anybody will pay for it. And by the way, if we do it inside the firewall and we charge on a consumption license basis, we can make a lot of money because there's a lot of consumption to be had. So when you think about, since maybe 2012, everybody in 2013, people moved into a forensic, more of the forensic model of, I'm going to create a better algorithm. I'm going to correlate better. I'm going to do this because you can't stop what's coming through the firewall. You can't stop anything. You can't reduce that traffic. It's already in your network. Well, that's what everybody promoted, and no one actually attempted to solve on a commercial way. Well, we were doing it. Centripetal was doing it since 2010, but they were in stealth mode till 2019. But there was nobody else really sitting there saying, I'm going to try to stop unintended network traffic outside the firewall. There was the DDoS aspect, but that was a DDoS specific. That's not saying on a normal day, I'm just going to sit there and block all this traffic. Because when you think about it, they were all making too much money. I mean, honestly, that's the way it is.
Well, let's dive into some money questions now then. So like a lot of this is, a lot of the traffic, a lot of everything is, we kind of designed the system to encourage that now. We've got capacity, we just charge for it, but the capacity is all now there, so there's no incentives to being lean. So, but how does this kind of impact scalability and also, things like your hardware spendings and cloud spendings and other areas like that?
So we have a customer as a decent sized healthcare provider. Okay. And when we looked at, we sit outside. So, we sit outside the firewall and we leverage, just to give everybody an idea, we leverage all threat intelligence data on a global scale. No one's ever attempted it. We, quite frankly, I think when the founders started, they didn't even think it was possible. But so we see everything and we're able to look at every IOC in the world, and we apply that and we are able to block on it. Right. Okay. So that's the basis. When we install in front of a customer, we start to see everything. So this particular healthcare provider was getting about 60 million events a day into their Splunk. 60 million. It equated to about 138 gigs average daily. Okay. So when you talk about a Splunk that's charging on an average daily ingest per gigabyte, that's 138 gigs. Okay. So we tune it for 30 days. And take a guess. What do you think we reduced it to? Just off the top, like if the best you can reduce it, what do you think it would go down to? From 138 gigs to what?
I'm gonna go 50%. I think I feel like that's bold, but I'm gonna go bold.
Okay.
I'm not going to take a guess because we already talked about this and I already know the number.
Okay. 200, they went from 138 gigs averaging a day to 264 megabytes.
Jesus.
From 60
yeah.
million events per day to 500,000. So you're talking that 98% of their traffic was garbage. And we didn't interrupt a single app, no one even knew we were there, except the security team who's sitting there with their eyes going, we just got a lot of budget back. You know, and it's like, that's the event. So, you know, and then the other thing that we see is how many people will look at that and go, what did we spent our money, how many tens of thousands or $1 million upgrading a network so that we could account for what? Not even our end users. Because, you know, everybody says data's going up, but is it legitimate data? No, it's illegitimate data and advertising and all this other stuff. So that's what you're buying. That's what you're upgrading your architecture for. In most cases, not all, but the large majority.
There's the impact on kind of security in the larger and the larger surface here is obvious. But when reducing that noise, how are you able to kind of not reduce the things that are important? How are you able to really pinpoint? Because the reduction that you just talked about in that example is so massive that it kind of seems like how are you able to filter out what's important and what's not in there?
So our president, I want to shout out Jonathan Rogers, who's actually the son of the founder, Stephen Rogers of Centripetal. Stephen and his team came from the NSA, and they have every tool imaginable, and they did some other things within that his profile is vast as far as what they were doing. And they saw from having every tool that not every enterprise is going to have all these tools. So how do you stop the noise? How do you even begin to address an adversary when you don't have the tools to do it? And so they got a grant, and the goal was, we're going to go get and what it is the dynamic threat. It's important to understand. This isn't, people talk about 0 days and how do you find a 0 day if it's 0 day? Well, the first thing that they looked at was to say, we're in this phase of everything's dynamic. You have domain fronting. Someone could have an IP address that may or may not be bad reputation, but the domains they keep putting in front of it, multiple of them, those aren't, some people have those as bad, some people don't. So what we do and what they figured out, again, could they do it? Don't know, but they spent 10 years doing nothing but installed on high traffic networks, seeing if this could be built. And that is, go buy every basic commercial viable threat intelligence feed on the planet, feed it into a super curator with an AI assistant and really good SecOps team. So we take basically every IOC exists and we put it. So we're the largest database of indicators of compromise on the planet outside of probably the NSA. So we put that in and we break that. We take from 10 billion down and we were able to correlate a lot of those. And I'll get on one aspect that's interesting about the threat intel business, but we take that all down and then we're able to, with a high confidence, then block. So we don't interrupt anything because we're not looking at anything that isn't known in the global threat community with a high confidence that is bad. So we're not looking at a protocol or port or a certain CVE or anything. We're looking at purely what the world thinks is bad. And we're just blocking it. IP, URL, URI, domain, combination of which. Does that make sense?
That definitely does. But I do have a question here, and I'm glad you brought on the aspect of security here, because we're the Security Repo podcast. That's why we're here to talk all things security. So that logically makes sense. We have the threat intelligence. We're parsing it at an amazing scale and applying this to your network. But you brought that case earlier where it's like order of magnitude, a couple orders of magnitude, you reduced that traffic. How do you tell the difference between what's benign and useless versus what's an actual threat? That's, I guess, that definition of like, is benign considered a threat if it's useless? Like, how are you drawing that distinction?
Well, we don't look at threat or benign. We look at good legitimate or illegitimate, if you put it that way, right? So we don't we do have a way of saying that, in our own internal, and when customers look at things, you could say, yeah, this is a big deal, right? But for us, it's where did it come from, or where is it going? Because we block on the way out too. So if someone, so when you look at, say, for example, the Google Chromecast browser, the Chrome browser that came out, right? That is taking advantage of people understanding that advertising traffic is now so prevalent that they won't look into it, and people just assume that when they click on an ad in Google, that, oh, that's a cool thing, I want to look at it. Well, people once set up a bunch of ads to nefarious places. Well, we would know that destination is nefarious, and we would block them from even going to that advertiser. So for us, it's not about threat or benign, it's about legitimate or illegitimate. Does that make sense? I mean, yes, it's about, like, this is a nefarious site, or this is a known bad IP address, but it's illegitimate, or it's being used for illegitimate activities. And that's more of the way I would categorize it, if you will.
Yeah, and that you bring up a really interesting fact with the egress, like the traffic going back out, because it makes a lot of sense. If I'm having to ingest this data and I'm having to parse it, I'm having to move it around and look at things, that's going to cost me money. But I need to send things back out. I need to send a response to that, and I'm literally doubling my cost. Like, it's got to hit everything on the way back out.
I will also say, here's another aspect from an operational perspective that was fascinating to me, is that I've talked to several companies over the last few years, and I was sitting down with the chief security architect. This is probably a Fortune 500 company. And I was talking, and then the tier 3 level, the one who runs their SIM. Okay. And I was talking to them, asking them, just walk me through the process. Okay, you get from level 2, something has to be investigated, right? What information do you have? Is it DNS resolved? Is it not? Is it just an IP address? You go resolve it, whatever. He says it's an IP address because our network's so busy that if we turn on DNS resolution to this, it would shut down the network because it's so chatty to LDAP, right? So you get this, and then I said, okay, so you get that. You go say, who are they talking to, right? First step, right, of any security process. Okay, this host seems to have some nefarious activity. Who are they talking to? They're talking to this host. That's why we caught it. But who else are they talking to, right? Where does this maybe have spread or whatnot? So I said, so you make the request into the SIM to get that information back. How long does that take? And we're in a restaurant, and he starts looking around because he doesn't. I mean, you're like, oh my God, this is going to be good. He goes, 3 days. I go, what? He goes, exactly. He goes, the time it takes for the database of the SIM with so much data in it to query all that, bundle it up, or present it to me so that I can investigate it is, I go, you could have a legit threat going on, compromise in your network, and you wouldn't be able to even know for 3 days? He goes, exactly. And that's not uncommon, by the way, which is why this. So when you start talking about, yes, there's the cost of potentially, we see an average between 40 and 98% of data on networks. That's the average. The average is 80, honestly, of every customer we have. We have about 110 customers. 80% of the traffic on their networks is illegitimate, as I defined it. But when you talk about, there's the other operational cost of, with so much garbage data that has to be indexed into security tools, it takes time to pull that out to do an investigation. It's just a matter of computational power, and so people are trying to increase that. And that's where, the elastics of the world and stuff, where they've gotten a better index engine, are so critical to being able to sift through that. But eventually it's just a matter of how much data and how fast can you get through it? How big of a box are you willing to build to scan through that data?
So, I mean, you talked about something really interesting there, that it would take 3 days, for someone to even understand that they have a threat going on in a kind of traditional, let's call it traditional kind of sense of trying to sift through that data. Why is it so difficult determining this illegitimate traffic as you defined it? Why is it so hard to define this or find this in the traditional approach? And I mean, we've talked a little bit about how you're cutting through it, but what's so different about that now as to kind of then?
The amount is difficult. So here's what you saw in probably 2017, 28, you started to see a convergence of user behavior anomalies with your traditional SIM correlations, right? Because what companies, which was the right thing to do, but what that entailed was, and what the goal is to say this: if we index every single system that comes on, every IP address, and we tie it to a user, and then what we're going to do is every event associated with that IP address or host, we can then start to build, a story in alignment with, say, the MITRE attack framework or something like that. So now we know if a particular host has crossed the threshold, or are they working towards command and control, or they've done there's methods of attack, tools, tactics, procedures, TTPs people call them, but how far along is a host? So I have to track the host and all their activity. Well, you start to build that out. How many hosts can I actively track in a system with confidence and tying so every time some traffic comes in, I have to build an index table for every IP address that comes in. Well, if you have 80% of those IP addresses are not even legitimate IP addresses, they may be, fake IPs. They may be, anywhere in the world, different things. You start to have a gazillion IP addresses that your system's trying to build an index table for. So it gets overwhelming, because it's not just saying I'm feeding up like the old snort CVE alerts. I'm actually piecing together an entire narrative about every IP address, which means that I have to take information from every other security tool, and I have to start weaving it together into a narrative in real time. And I'll give you an example of where this. So let me take a step back there. Does that answer your question of why it's so difficult?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, because there's another, and I'm sorry because it brings me to another scenario of real world implications of this. When you have so much illegitimate traffic, there was a breach that everyone knows about. It's the SolarWinds supply chain breach, right? You think about every security company in the world that should have caught that, and not one, only one actually did, and that was FireEye. And so just, truth be told, I was at FireEye just after that for a few years, but I got to understand how they found it. And let me tell you, it wasn't some super dynamic FireEye so much better than everybody else. FireEye's a great, the tools are great. So are a lot of the other tools. There's a lot of great tools. This isn't, I want to be clear with everybody. I'm not suggesting in any way that a lot of the SIMs, XDRs, and all this stuff are not good at what they do. Quite the opposite. I'm saying it's a bet against a difficult. As our president says, the largest big data problem in the world, because it's so dynamic and it's difficult to address. So I just wanted to not alienate everyone in my life from a security perspective. I'm just saying it's an excessively difficult thing to resolve. But the SolarWinds thing was only found because there was a guy in the FireEye SOC who happened to see the data was presented. And this is where what people talk about algorithms, it still comes down to people. And people saying, what is it that I'm looking at that is my biggest threat? And they choose to investigate that. And he said, why is that server logging into that server? I think that might have been the second time I've seen it do that. And he happened to click on it. And a lot of times you think it's nothing, or maybe it's something or whatever. And sure enough, so no other vendor who claims to say that they stop breaches or does anything else to their product, nobody, think of all the security vendors in the world, not one person saw that. And how long was it going on? Except one analyst who happened to say, that's interesting, right? How many dashboards in the world had the same thing and no one clicked on it? Or were waiting 3 days, and by that time they couldn't figure out what it was.
That very much is something we say around here. Like, tools alone don't fix security. They just don't. They help. You got to have a tool, otherwise you're just staring at a box. But yeah, it does come down to people, the proper training, proper processes, and then just relying on what humans are great at, spotting anomalies and weird patterns and saying, I'm curious to what that is. But
I'm briefly interrupting this episode to talk about the Security Repo's sponsor, GitGuardian. GitGuardian is a code security platform that specializes in detecting secrets in your development workflows and also in your code repositories. Not only can GitGuardian bring to the surface all of those leaked secrets from way back in the history in your projects, but it can also let you know when systems have been breached by using their brand new Honey Token module. Honey Tokens are fake credentials that you can put in your environments and also in your third-party tools to know when they've been compromised. GitGuardian is free for all teams with less than 25 developers. You can sign up today at gitguardian.com. All right, back to the episode.
You talk to a lot of people in security, and our audience was always curious what the CISOs are saying about stuff. I would love to get a little perspective on how are security leads reacting to this news? Like, hey, most of your data is junk and it's costing you.
Well, it's not even since I've been here, but I've had some of the most fascinating conversations, I would say, in my career over the last 3 or 4 years. Actually, yeah, probably the last 3.5 years. And it was, and it's been the same conversation. Like, I don't know how we ended up there, but we just ended up there. And here's the conversation I've been talking, and it's not just CISOs. I'll give you the things that CISOs that I've heard are most concerned about, and then what they say when no one else is around. And I've had these conversations, and again, the guy at the restaurant was looking around, chief security architects or CISOs. I've had the same conversation, and I remember being out to lunch with one of them, and I said, and he said, "Yeah, let's go to lunch." Okay. And we're talking and we're catching up and, whatever. And I said, "Hey, you know what? I just want to let you know, this is a chief security architect for a Fortune 500 company." And I said, "I will," different from the other Fortune 500 companies. I didn't want to think it's just one person. This is multiple, right? And I said, "I will have lunch with you all the time because I'm fascinated by what decisions you make and the process by which you go about those decisions. So did you want to go to lunch every day? I'm here because this is, great stuff. But was there a reason we're supposed to, is there something you wanted to know?" And it was funny to look. And I'm telling you, I had the same conversation with no less than 3 security architects and 3 CISOs within a 2-year period. And this is what they do. Again, looking around, is anybody listening? Like, we're in a busy restaurant, but still, right? And they go, let me stop there real quick. These are companies that have spent millions on security. Okay. I don't think we have the tools in place to actually find the threats that matter. Like, I don't think we would see if the threat, and this drives me absolutely crazy. Like, I worry every day that I'm getting the phone call that day. We've been breached and it's massive, because I don't think, when I ask questions, I don't get the answer. And one of the questions they ask is, what's my risk score today? What's my true risk today? And what was it yesterday? And, I tell people, it's an incredibly hard thing to tell someone. It's incredibly hard because you actually have to pull in the network team. You have to pull in the security team. You have to pull in the application teams. You guys know this from what you guys do, like, they could tell you all day long, the security team could tell all day long what their security risk is. Then you guys are going to go show them where their passwords and usernames are hidden in applications in 2 seconds. And they go, "Oh, we forgot to ask the application team." So it's a difficult thing to do, but there's not even a real process, they feel, to say, okay, what equals my risk score, that if I was to have an exposure, here's where it would be.
Yeah, and it's getting even harder and harder to even begin to determine that, with all the added elements of supply chains and other areas, because one of the scariest things about security is that you can do everything perfectly. You've done everything, but the nature of how dependent we are on so many different services, from cloud infrastructure to third-party tools, even your security tools are potentially a risk. Not saying that you shouldn't have them. I'm just saying that it's a potential avenue for an attacker, that, like, you do everything perfectly and you can still get that phone call. You can still get the phone call to say, yeah.
And this is where I want to tie it back, that you're absolutely right. And the only chance you have is to reduce the amount of information you have to sift through. And everybody's been talking about, oh, we can reduce noise from forensic algorithms. Hasn't worked, hasn't worked. And one thing I will tell you is, the Verizon data breach report said They said that 90% of the breaches that they have reported on over the last certain amount of years, 90% of them had threat intel available in the world that had they had that and operationalized it and had the skill set people to recognize it, they could have prevented the breach. But the first stop was you could have known it was out there if you had the right, information operationalized. And that's difficult when there's so much data to try to sift through. So it's incredibly hard. And I want to bring it back to one other point that you had mentioned earlier, which is the cost, because there is no incentive for it to get better. Microsoft Sentinel, great solution. They charge by the amount of data analyzed. Why would they ever want to reduce the amount of data analyzed? Why?
Yeah. Why make a car that's going to last longer than 10 years?
And I don't fault it. This isn't me. This isn't an idealistic thing. What I'm out there saying, good on you. You can make a good business this way. No one said you were, some idealistic, angel out there. This is about making a business, right? But people need to understand the partners that they have and what's their motivation, so that you understand what you're getting in bed with, right?
Yeah, they're doing the best for addressing the market as it is and addressing the problem set as they see it and as it's understood. It's literally like we sell better hammers and better nails, and over here you're yelling, but a screw would work so much better. So much less work for everyone.
That is a great analogy on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's apples to
Yeah,
apples,
and
but it's there.
And you just need the disruptors, the screw manufacturers in your analogy, Dwayne, to come in here and disrupt the business and force change.
Well, I'm saying like the disruptor is it, but here's the interesting thing. It's one of those things where you say, yes, we could impact that business in a way on this one aspect of it. However, your tool will actually function to be so much more effective that people will enjoy using it more. Because you'll actually be able to function. People will actually have better security, and therefore they will think your tool's even better because it's not being overwhelmed. But are people going to care about that or the revenue potential loss?
It's a crowded market at the moment. There's going to, as we're going through turbulent times a little bit, some vendors, even some big ones, are starting to fall off the ledge a bit. Well, it's going to be the innovative ones. Yeah.
You bring that up. Actually, that you're 100%. Let me tell you what's happening now. Actually, on the other aspect of it, because this is really important. On the other side, that you just literally hit was this. I know several companies right now, larger companies, banks, healthcare, whatever. They have a utilization or consumption based SIM XDR, and now that model is turning on itself. Why? Because they literally can't accept any more events into that SIM without an even larger license and actually building, because it's on premise, a larger platform for it. And the business just said, oh, heck no, we're not doing that. So they've had to actually bring in a secondary XDR platform because it can sample stuff or do something different because they couldn't get any more money. So in this case, actually, because of the way the model's working, they've actually introduced and given opportunity to their competitor. You see, so now it's like, wait a minute. Okay, so now all it's been fun until the data exceeded budgets in such a way that people were saying no more. It's like I say, it's the old James Belushi from the Principal movie, no more.
Buck, I could talk to you all day, and I'm struggling to bring myself to wrap it up. But I am conscious of time, and we're already going a little bit over. But I want to ask you before we go, from your perspective, what's the best security advice that you could give someone, or maybe you have been given? And I want to know, what's the worst security advice that you've ever received, or maybe overheard, or just heard about? So let's start with the best. What's the best advice you would give to the audience or you've received?
I will. The best security advice I give someone is sort of almost life advice. And it's two things. First, what are you pretending not to know? Like, I didn't know someone could do this. I didn't know that. No, you did. You just, and I think I even saw it on one of your past podcasts or something, because I was kind of scanning through them, but it's pretend you're trying to breach yourself. You are the primary person to breach yourself because you know where the bones are, you know all the secrets. Now, how would you do it? And how could someone do it externally? If you think about breaching yourself, and so for me, it's work from almost a here's the keys, jewels of the kingdom, and work back in a way to say it's exponentially harder to get there. But really, what are you pretending not to know? And how do you breach yourself? That's what I ask people, and that goes in a number of different ways. But you have to be honest with yourself about the current state.
Nice. And let's flip it on its head a bit. What's the worst advice that you're kind of hearing out there in the ethos, or someone's told you?
What someone told me and I've heard before is, oh, that'll never happen. Oh, that's not possible. You know what I'm saying? Oh, nobody could do that. So what are you saying? They're going to do this, and that's why they're going to get this? Yeah. No one's going to do that. I'm like, well, for sure they're going to do it. Just because you said that now. Like that's the like you're going to regret saying that, because now you're going to go, oh my God, someone can do it. Right? It's like it goes to that thing of, we're covered, man. No one's going to be able to, this is like, what you're saying is that someone's going to be able to do blah, blah. I'll give you an example. You had someone on about social engineering to give you an idea. Like I had a friend of mine who used to do pen tests, and he was contracted to do a social and physical, social, and network penetration test of the Federal Reserve banks, several of them. And this was years ago. And he needed to get into one of the Federal Reserve banks. I won't say which one. It's not the one in Chicago, by the way. And so what he did was he started a small fire outside of the front of the Federal Reserve. And the security team came running out to see what the fire was about. And he was standing there and walked in, and then got the key swab from the desk while they were trying to handle the fire, and then walked in and was sitting in the data center when he emailed the people who contacted us. I'm sitting here at data center. And it's those like, okay, that's ridiculous. Totally fair point. That's ridiculous. But don't tell me it's not possible.
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
So it's good.
Yeah. It's amazing that like kind of what happens and that what people don't think is possible. And one of my favorite ones along the same line was someone that said, he was trying to explain the risk of something, and they said, yes, but that would be illegal. It's kind of like the same, it's kind of like, yeah.
That would be. Yeah, I don't think anybody's worried about that right now.
No. Well, Buck, I literally could talk to you for hours, but we're going to have to wrap this up. So I just want to say thanks for coming on the show. And the final question that I have is just, if people want to find out more about what we've been talking about, if perhaps they want to hear more from you, what's the best kind of place? Where can they kind of hear from you or hear more about the technologies you discussed? Yeah,
so just a shout out to my company that I work for, Centripetal Networks, Centripetal, 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 just like it sounds, networks. It's Centripetal Networks, centripetal.ai or centripetalnetworks.com. My email is bbunhund@centripetalnetworks.com. And, I love sharing information with people and talking about the issue. I was a former practitioner, so I've always approached things from, best practice, and I have contacts that call me, and it's not about who I'm working for. At times it's about, hey, what do you think about this challenge? Because I'm always, that's one thing I've enjoyed about this. So feel free to reach out to me, and, thank you all for inviting me on here. And I'm looking forward, Dwayne, to more BurbSecs and seeing what other topics we can come up with, because it is one of those fascinating things that people really haven't taken a moment to digest about how much, it is out there and how much is coming in illegitimately.
Yeah, and that's a great note to end it on. Thanks very much for being here. And just wanted to give a shout out to BurbSec again, SEC. If you're in the greater Chicagoland area, there is a BurbSec near you. There is, I think, 5 meetings a month. East is the one that happens in Chicago, closest to us, or closest to me. That's where I met Buck here. So just a shout out to that awesome community. Hope to see you there if you can make it out. Go find them on Meetup.
Definitely, 100% agree. It's a great time, and I would even, if you don't mind me saying one other thing, Dwayne. One of our main offices is in Galway, Ireland, and I'm encouraging my Galway, Ireland office to go to the BurbSec out there. It's gone global, so that's phenomenal. But it's a great group. I can't encourage enough people to attend it.